I never told my son the truth about my money. Not because I was ashamed of it. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I had watched too many people in my life change the moment they learned what someone was really worth. And I didn't want that to happen with my own child. My son doesn't know I have $52,000 coming in every single month. He thinks I moved in with him because I couldn't afford to stay in my house after his father passed. He thinks I sold the house to cover debts. He thinks I rely on a small Social Security check and whatever kindness he and his wife are willing to show me. He thinks wrong. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a senior financial consultant for a private wealth management firm in Atlanta before I retired. When my husband Robert passed 3 years ago, he left me the investment portfolio he'd been quietly building since the 1980s. Combined with my own savings, my pension, and the dividend income from a commercial property Robert and I purchased in 2004, I bring in more every month than most people make in a year. But my son didn't know any of that. He knew me as his mother, the woman who packed his lunches, drove him to baseball practice, sat up with him when he had a fever. He knew me as the woman who cried at his wedding and danced too long at the reception. He knew me as the woman who showed up at his door 8 months ago with 2 suitcases and tired eyes after the funeral. What he didn't know was that I showed up that way on purpose. My daughter-in-law's name is Vanessa. She's 34, sharp-featured, and has a talent for making you feel small in your own skin. She works part-time at a marketing agency and spends the rest of her time managing what she considers to be her household, her schedule, and her image. From the moment my son brought her home for Thanksgiving 4 years ago, I sensed something careful and calculating behind her smile. She was never rude to my face then. Not quite, but there was always a slight pause before she answered me. A half-second too long. Like she was deciding how much effort I was worth. When I moved in, that pause got shorter, and the effort got less. The first few weeks were fine. She was gracious in a performative way, showing me the guest room, pointing out where the towels were kept, telling me to make myself comfortable. My son hugged me often, and seemed relieved I was nearby. He looked tired. He'd been working long hours at his construction management firm, bidding on contracts, chasing deadlines. I noticed the dark circles under his eyes and said nothing about them. I cooked dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. I kept the kitchen cleaner than it had ever been. I did my own laundry, made my own appointments, and asked for nothing. I was, by any reasonable measure, an easy guest. But to Vanessa, I was an intrusion. It started with small things. She would come home and glance at whatever I'd cooked with a look that landed somewhere between indifference and contempt. She stopped saying, "Thank you," around week 3. By week 5, she had started leaving dishes in the sink after I'd cleaned up, just to see, I think, whether I would wash them again. I did. Not because I felt I had to, but because I was watching, paying attention, building a picture. She talked about me to her friends on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the walls in that house are thinner than she realized. I heard the words dead weight once. I heard, "I don't know how much longer I can do this another time." I heard her laugh and say that I was probably expecting them to take care of me forever since I had nothing to my name. I sat in my room that evening with my hands folded in my lap, and I thought about Robert, about how he used to say that patience was the most expensive currency there was, and that only people who understood its true value knew when to spend it. I wasn't ready to spend it yet. Things shifted around month 3. Vanessa had a bad week at work. Something about a client dropping their account, and she came home Friday evening with a kind of energy that filled every room in the house. My son wasn't home yet. I was in the kitchen, warming up soup. She walked in, looked at me standing at the stove, and said quite simply, "You know we're not running a hotel here." I turned around and looked at her. "I'm making soup," I said. "Would you like some?" She stared at me for a moment like I'd said something absurd. Then she walked out. My son came home an hour later, and the two of them went upstairs. I could hear their voices through the ceiling. Not the words, just the tones. Hers was sharp and rising. His was low and placating. That pattern repeated often over the following weeks. She began making comments at the dinner table about how much the utilities had gone up, about how the grocery bill was higher than it used to be. She never said my name when she said these things. She would just let the information float there, over the food, for everyone to absorb. My son would look at his plate. I would look at her. One evening, I offered to contribute to the household expenses. My son immediately said no. Absolutely not. I was family. Vanessa smiled at him with something that looked like satisfaction and said nothing. I noticed she didn't argue with him. She didn't have to. She had already made her point to both of us. It was a Tuesday in November when things broke open. My son had left early that morning for a site visit 3 hours away. He wouldn't be back until evening. I had cleaned up after breakfast and was sitting in the living room reading when Vanessa came downstairs later than usual. She stood in the entrance to the living room in her robe and looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've been meaning to get rid of. I need to talk to you, she said. I closed my book. She sat across from me and crossed her arms. She told me that she and my son had been talking. She told me that the arrangement wasn't working for them. She told me that they needed their space and their privacy, and that having another person in the house was putting a strain on things. She used words like boundaries and energy and going forward. Then she said, "Honestly, Margaret, there are places designed for people in your situation. You'd have your own space, activities, people, your own age. It would be better for everyone." I looked at her for a long moment. "Are you asking me to move into a retirement facility?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they think they're being diplomatic. "I'm suggesting it might be worth exploring." "And my son agreed to this conversation?" She hesitated. "Just barely. We've discussed it." I knew right then that they had not fully discussed it. My son would not have sent her down here alone if they were truly in agreement. He would have been beside her, uncomfortable and apologetic, but present. She was handling this herself because she knew he would soften if I looked at him directly. I nodded slowly and said, "I'll think about it." She seemed surprised I didn't argue. She stood up, smoothed her robe, and said something about how she knew I would understand. Then she went to the kitchen to make coffee, and that was that. I sat in the living room for a while after she left. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't hurt in the way she might have expected. What I felt was something more like clarity. The picture I had been building for 8 months finally showed me its full shape. I thought about what Robert would say. I thought about the envelope in my suitcase that I had brought with me when I moved in. The envelope I had placed there deliberately, just in case a moment like this one ever arrived. I called my attorney that afternoon. His name is Gerald. He's been my family's lawyer for 22 years, and he has a voice like gravel and a mind like a steel trap. I told him it was time to have a conversation about the documents. What my son and my daughter-in-law did not know, what they had never thought to ask about, was that the house they lived in had been purchased 6 years ago with a combination of my son's savings and a private loan. The loan had come from a trust. That trust was mine. Robert and I had set it up years ago as a vehicle for family lending, specifically to help our son buy his home without going through a bank and paying years of commercial interest. My son knew about the loan. He had been paying it back faithfully every month, direct deposit into an account he thought belonged to an estate management service. He did not know that the service was mine. He did not know that the trust was mine. He did not know that, because I held the note on his home loan, my name was embedded in the property deed as the senior secured creditor, with rights of first claim if the loan went into default. He was not in default. He had never missed a payment, and I had never once intended to exercise those rights until now, not to take anything from him, but to clarify very plainly who was and was not in a position to make decisions about whose home this was. I asked Gerald to prepare a summary letter. Just a letter, I told him. Plain and factual. Nothing aggressive. I wanted it to arrive by the end of the week. It arrived on a Thursday. My son opened it at the kitchen table before work. I watched his face as he read it. He went very still in the way that people do when they are recalculating something they thought they understood. He looked up at me. Then he looked at Vanessa, who was standing at the counter, scrolling her phone. "What is this?" he asked her. She looked up. "What?" He held out the letter. She took it. She read it standing there in her heels, already dressed for work, coffee in her other hand. I watched the coffee cup go slowly down to the counter. I watched her read it again. Then she looked at me. "You own the note on this house?" she said. "I've always owned the note on this house," I said. "Since the day your husband moved in." She stared at me. My son put both hands on the table and let out a long breath. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not triumph. That is not a feeling I have ever had much use for. What I felt was something closer to grief. Grief that we had arrived here at all. Grief that the woman sitting across from me had made it so easy to become someone I didn't particularly want to be. "Why didn't you tell me?" my son asked. His voice was quiet. He was not angry. He was something more painful than angry. He was confused in the way that only comes when someone you trusted turns out to have been carrying something heavy, alone. "Because I was watching," I said, "and I needed to see." He asked me to explain. So I did. I told him what I had seen over the past 8 months. I told him about the comments at dinner. I told him about being suggested for a retirement facility by a woman who had known me for 4 years. I told him about the conversations I had heard through the walls. I kept my voice even. I kept my hands in my lap. I did not cry, and I did not raise my voice, because Robert always said that the person who stays calm holds the room. Vanessa opened her mouth twice and closed it again. My son listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, how much do you actually bring in every month?" I told him. He sat back in his chair like he'd been pushed. Vanessa set down her coffee cup with a small, precise click. I told them about the pension, about the investment portfolio Robert had left me, about the commercial property in Decatur that generated income every month, whether I thought about it or not. I told them about the financial consulting work I still did occasionally, remotely, for 2 long-standing clients who refused to let me fully retire because they trusted no one else with their accounts. I told them the number. The kitchen was very quiet. My son looked at his wife. She was looking at the table. Her jaw was tight in a way I recognized. It was the jaw of a person rapidly recalculating what they had said and to whom and whether any of it could be walked back. "Vanessa?" my son said. Just her name, nothing else. But the way he said it contained everything that needed to be said. She looked up. "Did you tell her to leave?" he asked. "Without talking to me first?" Another pause. "I told her we should explore options. That's the same thing. I was just trying to—" "No," he said. "Stop." I had not expected that. I had prepared myself for a longer conversation, for more justification on her end, for more silence on his. But my son surprised me. He stood up from the table, and he looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. I didn't see it." I had to look away for a moment. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. My son called in late to work. Vanessa sat at the table through most of it with her arms folded. and I could see her working through something internal, something between defensiveness and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. To her credit, she did not leave the table. She stayed. I told them that I had no intention of taking the house. I told my son that the loan structure had been designed to protect him, not to control him, and that the moment he wished to formally refinance through a traditional lender, I would release my claim on the deed and he would owe me nothing further. I told them I was not interested in holding anything over anyone's head. What I was interested in, I said, was honesty. Complete honesty. In both directions. I told them that I had made a mistake in not being transparent about my financial situation from the beginning. I said it plainly, without hedging, because it was true. I had wanted to observe, and I had observed, and what I had learned had cost us all something that 8 months of watching couldn't give back. Even if Vanessa had responded exactly the same way, he deserved the chance to respond differently. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine and said, "I would have. I believe him." Vanessa was quiet for a long time after my son said that. I watched her face move through something I didn't have a name for yet. Then she looked at me and said, "I treated you like a burden." It wasn't phrased as an apology exactly. More like a recognition, an accounting. "Yes," I said. "You did. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "But I need you to hear something. It shouldn't have mattered. Whether I had $52,000 a month or $52, I was your husband's mother. That's what should have mattered." She held my gaze. Her eyes were different then. Not hard. Something had gone out of them that had been there since the beginning. She said, "You're right. I have spent a lot of years in rooms where very smart, very proud people said those 2 words. And I have learned to know when they mean it. She meant it. Not fully, not yet, and not without the complicated residue of everything she'd said and done over those months. But the foundation of it was real. I moved out of the guest room 2 weeks later. Not because they asked me to. Because I had purchased a condominium in a building 12 minutes away 6 years earlier, when Robert and I first started talking about retirement, imagining a place that was ours, quiet, with good light and no stairs. The condo had been sitting, rented, generating income, waiting. I had the tenants give their notice in November. I repainted the walls myself, slowly, over 3 weekends. It turns out painting is meditative when you're not in a hurry. My son helped me move. He drove 2 truckloads of boxes and furniture from the house to the condo, and he did it without being asked and without making it into anything other than what it was. On the last trip, standing in my new living room surrounded by boxes, he pulled me into a hug that went on longer than either of us planned. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "About all of it? From the beginning?" "Because I needed to know who you were when you thought I had nothing," I told him. "And I needed to know who she was." He was quiet for a moment. "And now you know." "Now I know." He came over for dinner the following Sunday. He brought Vanessa. She arrived holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that was newer than the ones I'd seen before. Less armored, less certain of itself. She walked into my condo and looked around at the bookshelves and the light coming through the west windows and said, quietly, "This is beautiful, Margaret." I took the wine and told her to sit down. We ate at my dining room table, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about money, not about the house, not about the past 8 months. We talked about my son's new contract, a major school renovation project he'd been bidding on for months. We talked about Vanessa's promotion at the agency, which had come through quietly while everything else was happening. We talked about Robert and the things he used to say at the table and how my son laughs, sometimes in exactly the same way his father used to laugh. At some point in the evening, Vanessa asked me about my work. Not in a polite, conversational way. In the way someone asks when they're actually curious. She asked how I had gotten into wealth management, what I had found most difficult about it, what I had loved. I answered her honestly. We talked for 40 minutes about investment strategy and risk management and the particular challenges women in finance faced in the 1990s. And I watched something kindle in her eyes that I hadn't seen there before. She is sharp, my daughter-in-law. Underneath all of it, she is genuinely sharp. Before they left that evening, she hugged me at the door. Brief and slightly awkward, in the way of someone practicing something they aren't used to yet. But she did it. I stood in my doorway and watched their car pull out of the parking lot, and I held what I was feeling for a moment, trying to understand what it was. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was something quieter. The particular piece of a person who has waited the right amount of time for the right moment, and then spent it well. Robert would have had something to say about all of it. He would have sat in that dining room chair with his coffee and his small smile and said something that sounded simple and turned out to be everything. He had a gift for that. I thought about what he used to tell me when I came home from difficult client meetings, from conversations with people who had underestimated me, from rooms where I had been the only woman and had to work twice as hard to be heard half as well. He would say, "The money is just the proof, but the knowledge is the power. Don't spend the proof too early." I held on to that for 30 years. I held on to it in that guest room for 8 months. I held on to it on that Tuesday morning in November when Vanessa sat across from me in her robe and told me to explore other options. And I spent it at exactly the right time. My granddaughter was born 4 months after I moved into the condo. My son called me at 6 in the morning, voice cracking, and said, "Mom, it's a girl." I was in my car 11 minutes later. I held her in that hospital room while the morning light came through the blinds and she made the small searching expressions of someone just beginning to figure out what kind of world she'd arrived in. My son stood beside me with his hand on my shoulder. Vanessa watched from the bed, exhausted and undone and more open than I had ever seen her. "What do you think?" my son asked me. I looked at my granddaughter's face. I looked at my son. I looked at his wife. "I think," I said slowly. Vanessa laughed. A real laugh. The first one I had heard from her that wasn't designed for an audience. The three of us sat in that room for a long time. Not talking much. Not needing to. Just present with the particular weight of a morning that changes the shape of everything that comes before and after it. On my way home, I stopped at the cemetery. I brought 2 coffees, the way I always did, and left one on the ground beside the headstone, the way Robert always liked his. Black, no sugar. I stood there in the early morning cold and told him everything. About the letter, about the conversation in the kitchen, about the condominium and the dining room, and the wine Vanessa had brought, and how sharp she was when she let herself be. About the baby, about the chin. The January wind moved through the bare trees. And I stood there until the coffee got cold, and then I stood there a little longer, because some moments deserve more time than we usually give them. Because patience, as Robert always said, is the most expensive currency there is. And some things are worth every cent.